welcome Escalon Presbyterian Church to a conversation with my professor, my supervisor from across the pond, Dr. Tom Griggs. Welcome, Tom.
It's really good to be with you, Troy, and to meet all of your church electronically. I hope that there's a chance to do so in person at some point soon.
Yeah, I would love to have you preach here, and wanted to introduce you to our church. They know you as, my boys refer to you as Professor Tom, and you do not fit the stereotype of the movies that we have over here that suggest that the British professor is white-haired and spectacles and locked away in an attic and very odd.
I don't know. I think my wife would tell you that I am very odd, and I do wear spectacles, but I've got contact lenses in at the moment, and the hair's definitely greying. So I'm going towards that direction. But it's it's just been a real joy to have worked with you over the last few years, and it's nice to be able to speak to your congregation, having been the person that's taken their pastor away from them for significant portions of time while you've been researching over at Aberdeen. So I'm glad I'm not fitting a stereotype, but I think I'm growing into it ever more.
Very good. So obviously this is a new time for many of us in the world, and we're speaking, of course, as Christians. And tell us a little bit about how you and your wife Heather are handling this coronavirus pandemic. What's it like there in northern Scotland and Aberdeen for you?
Well, we live quite rurally, so in some ways we feel like we're very fortunate and blessed because it's pretty quiet where we are anyway, and there's not that many people that live around where we are, so we're quite isolated. The honest answer, really, I know that you're looking for a bit of spiritual nourishment for your watching. And we're also coping with it by making sure that we have plenty of gin to drink, especially since my parents and grandmother are staying at the moment. So that's the honest answer. The more spiritual answer is that we're trying to do three things, I guess, or maybe four things. The first is that the church that we belong to every morning is asking us all to pray at the same time, 8:30 in the morning, and sending a little liturgy out for us. And we're calling it 7 whole days from the hymn, 7 whole days, not 1 in 7, I will love thee. So there's a short act of worship there that we're doing alongside other people who are scattered. And then we're having quite a significant time of prayer, both giving thanks and of intercession before dinner with all of our family. And then we are, especially since my dad's also a former church worker, we're having a small service just around our kitchen table at 11 on Sunday, just using the readings for the week. My parents and grandmother and wife are certainly not interested in hearing me preach, so there's no sermon taking place. We are trying to follow the broad structure of a service with prayers of adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and the Lord's Prayer, having the readings, having some intercessions, and then breaking bread and sharing wine with each other, just using a very stripped back liturgy. And we're rejoicing in that context, in the fact that, as members of Protestant churches where we have ministers who fulfill things for the sake of order, that nevertheless all of us are able to approach the throne of grace confidently, and having a confidence that's grounded in who we are in Jesus Christ. So they're the three kind of God-orientated things. The fourth thing that we're doing is trying to make sure that we phone people, particularly people that we know are isolated at the moment, on a sort of daily basis or so, just to check in with them, so there's a sense of community as well. At the church that we belong to, we've sort of all identified people that we want to contribute to, that we want to speak to and support through this period of time. But more generally, we've been trying to do that with the community.
That's great. Yeah, we're doing a number of things similarly. Our board of deacons is, gosh, routinely calling people in our congregation to check on them, see how they're doing. And as we're heading into Holy Week, boy, this is a unique time for the church and a unique time for us. Thinking about these celebrations of Palm Sunday and Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and Easter morning, and the thought of not doing it with the church body in our sanctuary is daunting. It's strange, and yet many people are still very, very hopeful that God can work in and through this time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been seeing ways in which people are really growing in their faith from home, having conversations with people, as you say, studying the Bible deeply, and lots of prayer in this time. But just was curious about your reflections on Holy Week and what we can keep in forefront of our minds as we consider the events of that Holy Week, and doing so from home. Are there points of connection that you see in that story that can really help us stay true to the gospel message and flourish in our own lives during this time?
Yeah, I mean, I feel similarly that it feels so strange to enter into Holy Week. It feels very strange for me to be entering into Holy Week and not having services to take or opportunities to preach. And nevertheless, I think the preacher in me overtook me this morning, thinking about what sort of things I would preach at the moment. Did I have a pulpit? Did I have an opportunity to do so? And one of the things that I'm really terribly struck by in the way that we approach Holy Week is that we can be very formulaic sometimes, that we read all of these things knowing it's, and therefore we don't allow the story, the narrative, the history, the sort of particularities of the text and the story to really touch us and hit us as we read through them. We sometimes deal with the text a bit like there's some kind of great physics equation in the sky that brings about salvation. And certainly there is that. Certainly there's all of the models of salvation that we'd want to talk about, but there is also a very deeply, deeply human story in this text about a man who goes from being hailed as the King of the Jews, as the promised Messiah, as the one who is lauded with palms, as the one who shows himself actually in the actions he fulfills to be a king, although a king in a very different way, the one who is surrounded by community and hope. And then almost immediately, almost in the click of a set of fingers, within just a few days, you find him utterly isolated. I don't know about how you guys feel, but for me, it's been such a shock to have gone from the busyness of life, seeing people all the time, being overwhelmed by people, to immediately having this isolation, to immediately being in a situation where we are alone behind closed doors. I'm thinking this morning again about the narratives of Holy Week, the stories of Jesus leading up to his death and resurrection, stories of the disciples in that context as well. I'm so struck by the resonance there is at the moment for us as people who find ourselves alone. I mean, think about the number of times through those stories that Jesus is alone. You know, whether it's that he's alone to pray in Gethsemane, whether it's that he's alone once he's taken away from the disciples, whether it's that he's alone because he's denied by Peter, the most forthright of all of the disciples, whether it's that he's alone because even the beloved disciple at that worst moment flees from him to such a degree that presumably, you know, a guard must have tried to grab hold of him and pulls the shirt off his back so he flees nakedly. That's how desperately alone Jesus is, that this person that everybody hailed on Palm Sunday, this person that everybody rejoiced in, that everybody couldn't get enough of, is so alone that people will even flee from him in a position of shame, in the position of nakedness at the end. And then, of course, he is alone before God, ultimately surrendering his spirit to God, alone upon the cross, and there he hangs dead alone. When he's put in the grave, he goes leave alone, not even with a degree of ceremony, because the Sabbath is approaching, and it would be improper and impure for him to either be left there or for there to be particular ceremony in the burial. I was really struck by that today, actually driving past the cemetery in the village where we live, where there was a funeral with just 2 people at, because that's the maximum number of people we can have gathering together at the moment in the UK. And I'm really struck by the fact, before I even get onto the disciples with all of this, I'm really struck by the fact that the story of Holy Week is a story of a God who is with us, not at the triumphs of life, not at the high points, not at the mountaintop experiences, but is with us walking the path that we walk, in fact, showing us what that path is that we're to walk. And in the situation in which we find ourselves as alone, Christ is with us in our isolation, in our loneliness, finding us there and bringing joy to us there. And I guess that's where, for me, the disciple story comes in. Because what's the first moment that we see? It's Mary alone weeping in the garden. And Jesus comes to her in her loneliness, in her isolation, in her sense that everything has gone wrong, in the fear that she has, and meets her there. And then where does he turn up? He turns up in a locked room because people are hiding there for fear of death, just like we're hiding at the moment in isolation for fear of death, albeit different. I'm struck by that irony in Scripture, that we're told that Christ is the one who stands at the door and knocks. But we're also told that in the power of his resurrection, he makes his way into locked rooms. I think at the moment, this Easter for me, that will be my tremendous sense of who the resurrected Christ is. He's the one that makes his way into locked, isolated places and brings peace and brings comfort and brings hope, even in the most difficult of times.
Oh, really well said, Tom. I was struck by the comment you made with respect to Holy Week, is the way in which we can often make it formulaic and miss the bits of the story. Say a little bit more about that. Why do we tend to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I have this little book coming out in a couple of months called The Breadth of Salvation, where I'm trying to get people to think about the feast that is on offer from God when it comes to salvation. I think that perhaps we do that formulaic aspect of approaching salvation because we can behave sometimes as if salvation is just an insurance policy to get us into heaven after we die. You know, you pay the funeral director in one way and take out an insurance policy with them, and you take out an insurance policy for your soul by going to church each Sunday and making sure that you're in the right place when it comes to all of that. I think that for me, that's an aspect certainly of what salvation is. Salvation is certainly about the hope of glory in heaven, the assurance, not insurance, but assurance of that. But salvation is much more than that, it seems to me. It's about God reconciling God's self with us. It's about God being at one with us and enabling us to be at one with him, with ourselves, and with one another. And when we rush to think about the hope of glory, when we rush to think about what we have after this life, sometimes we fail to glimpse the abundance of salvation now that we have through the deposit of the Holy Spirit, who's given to us as a guarantor of our salvation. God could have saved us in all kinds of ways, but he chooses to do it in this human life, in this very particular human life, in this very particular human life of somebody who suffers the types of woes and difficulties that we have. Because God isn't just interested in reconciling us with him after our death. God is interested in reconciling God's self with us in all of the moments of our life, in the here and now. Not just the mountaintop experiences, not just the Palm Sundays, but also the Monday, Thursdays, and the Good Fridays. And even more so, the Holy Saturdays, when there's absolute silence. And in fact, we are left alone without Christ. And even in those moments, God desires to save us. I in fact think that the moment of Holy Saturday is a really interesting one. Why have that break for the resurrection? Why is that so important? It's so important, it seems to me, to have that moment, because in fact, there will be moments in life where we've cried that prayer of dereliction. You know, my God, how hast thou forsaken me? And there is no answer, and there isn't even an immediate response. And we can feel left alone in that place where that there is a valley of the shadow of death. But what God does in those places is to shine his peace and light to remind us that those shadows are only shadows, and that the valley isn't a place that we will remain in forever. I think maybe we reach those sorts of formulaic accounts because we diminish all that is on offer in salvation. The way sometimes I say this to my own congregations and my students is to say, if you imagine a fantastic buffet that's in front of you, you know, the sorts of things that perhaps we're all desperate for now that we've been locked away, you know, those fantastic breakfast buffets that you get in hotels where there's everything that's possibly could imagine on offer: sausages and scones, or biscuits as you guys call them, and eggs and pulled brisket and pancakes and bananas and fruit and yogurt and kippers and fish and hams and cheeses and bread. And there's all of this in front of us. If salvation were like that, very often I think in the church we can be a bit like those people that I really judge in hotels as being immensely boring, who just, you know, go and get a little bit of granola and a bit of yogurt and that's what does them, or one piece of grapefruit or something. The point of a feast is that you feast on it. And salvation is a deep feast. And through the course of Holy Week, we see some of the courses that God offers us. Not just the once for all activity of the cross, but the once for all activity of the cross that is given all the more power by virtue of the life that precedes it, that meets us in the very real lives that we live as well. Does that answer the type of question that you're asking?
Yeah, it does. I appreciate you saying that. The depth of Holy Week really is coming out in this. And kind of closing this up, let's talk about Easter morning now. You know, you're sitting at home and I will be as well. And Easter comes, and what's kind of the spiritual thought that we should be drawn to in this time? Can we still have joy of what's happened on that day, even though we are in the places we are?
I think we can have joy in hope.
Yeah.
That would be my way of describing it. The thing about hope is it's not given to us straight away. It's not the fulfillment of the thing already. It's the thing for which we hope. Mm-hmm. And for me, one of the messages of Easter is that however bad the situation is, even if you're Mary Magdalene and you're crying because you think somebody's stolen the body of Jesus, and you think you're talking to a gardener, and that gardener seems to be making everything worse because you don't realize it's Jesus that you're talking to. Even if you are Hare, the story of Easter is a story of hope. She can't hold on to Jesus. It's not the full realization of everything. We don't get everything immediately. But it is the hope that there is nothing in the world that ultimately can separate us from the love of God. That wonderful passage in Romans 8, which is so powerful. For me, Easter brings joy, not because, like a magic trick, everything's sorted out on that morning. In fact,
Mm.
You know, when you read the story, Easter Day is a day full of confusion, upset, annoyance with each other, fear. You know, nothing is sorted out straight away on Easter Sunday morning. But what we have on Easter Sunday morning is the story of a God who cannot be contained, who cannot even be contained by sin and death and hell. And even if we find ourselves in the depths of hell and sin, in the desperation of the fear of death, gives us hope, because we are members of Jesus Christ, who prayed, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Who gave up his spirit in agony to the Father. And yet, even in that darkest of circumstances, even in the anguish and misery of that, even all of that, it is infinitely less than the power of God's love, which overcomes all of that and gives us hope. I suspect this Easter Sunday morning might be an Easter Sunday where we're reminded to hope, actually, and that the Christian life is a life of hoping, not of realization, not of beds of roses, not of, you know, all being happy straight away, because we live normal human lives. But in these normal human lives, we have the hope of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The one who is with us by his Spirit and breathes his peace upon us. And that's what I'm going to be meditating on Easter Sunday morning. And I think practically one of the things that I want to try to do is to replicate in the house as much the feeling that you have on Easter Sunday morning in the life of the church. Playing some good old gospel music for me, because that's my favourite sort. And of course, a few Wesley hymns, because I am a member of the true denomination. I am a Methodist. And cleaning the house from top to bottom is really important for me, that there is an aspect of preparation about all of this, and getting flowers and making sure that we have a verse of is to have the hope of resurrection. I'm really struck as well, really struck by the fact that in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Easter is celebrated in the middle of the night with the lighting of a bonfire. That in the darkness, there is the hope of light. And that the Easter day begins at that point. As soon as the sun is down, as soon as we're in pitch blackness, there is the moment of the Easter Vigil, because Christ finds us in those moments of darkness and brings us light.
That's going to stick with me for a while, Tom. That's well said. I'm particularly struck by your comment that Easter Sunday there's nothing neat and tidy about it in the gospel stories. I haven't thought it through in that way before, and that's remarkably true. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of confusion and fear and concern and faithlessness, even at that moment. Can this really be true? And letting the narrative of that day really frame our own understanding of it is key.
I think it's really important, actually, that we think that way. And I think so often our hymnody, our liturgy, we're expected to move from the depths of misery to the heights of joy. In fact, that never happens in the story of the resurrection at any point. Jesus comes in with peace and hope, but there is a situation where Thomas is still doubted, Peter's still denied, Cleopas and his companion have still been confused, Mary Magdalene has still been in floods of tears. You know, all of that isn't wiped away. The resurrection doesn't remove the fact that we will cry, but it does enable us to remember that one day God will wipe away every tear. It doesn't take away death, but it does take away its sting. And that, for me, is something that this strange Holy Week that we're about to have should really help us to remember, actually, and help us perhaps to live the realities that the disciples lived, more truly and with more integrity to ourselves and our own emotions than perhaps sometimes we do when we arrive in church on Easter Sunday morning and all greet one another with the Alleluia, and all seek to be filled with joy, when actually, often our lives are not in those places. And God brings his hope to us in the places that we are in, even if they're locked rooms, even if we've denied him, even if we've worried, even if we've been confused, even if we've been doubting, God finds us there and gives us hope.
Well said, Tom. Gosh, it's been just a pleasure talking with you about Easter week and its importance in our lives. And I have to confess, then I've broken one of the quarantine rules set by my denomination. The fact that I'm even conversing with the Methodists digitally is really against the grain.
It's okay. We'll pray for your soul. And you might have broken your denomination's rules, but since God is a Methodist, he will look after you and bless you with all of his many blessings by virtue of this.
Well, blessings to you and Heather and the rest of your family that is staying with you during this quarantine time.
Yeah. Blessings to you guys as well, and blessing on all of those of you who are listening, and you will be in my prayers on Easter Sunday morning. And I hope that you find an Easter filled with hope. God bless now.